Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Prabhat Shukla to Global Order again. Prabhat Shukla is a old China watcher, China hand, as it were, in India diplomatic circles. He's nodding his head, but he's been watching China with great care for a long, long time and follows very diligently and with great astute, insight or everything that comes out of China, including a lot of Chinese language information that's published in the Chinese language in Mandarin. The reason why I invited Ambassador Shukla to join me today is to discuss the very important third plenum of the Chinese Communist Party and to really understand what it really said to us about the future of Xi Jinping as the leader of China and indeed the future of the Communist Party in China. Thanks very much, Ambassador, for your time once again.
Thank you, Hindol. Always good to talk to you. But I must clarify one thing. I would not qualify to be called a China watcher, I guess. I do watch China, and I have been watching China for now about 30 years, starting with the time that President Xi Jinping, President Jiang Zemin visited India back in 1996. But I don't know Mandarin. I've never served in the mainland. So I watch it with all the attention and background research that I can do. But in the biradari of China watchers, I'm very much an outcast.
You're a person who watches China through translated information from Mandarin to English and not in the Mandarin original, which I guess is the sort of high status, as it were, among China watchers. But very astute comments as always on China, and therefore delighted to be talking to you. Let's begin, Ambassador, by talking about what really happened in the third plenum. China is going through a lot of change. One of the big changes is the demographic change. Perhaps it's the biggest problem that China faces today. This demographic fall that it will see in the decades to come will transform China. Let's begin by talking about economically, what are the biggest insights you think that you sort of extracted from the third plenum and what came out of it?
Hindol, I have a counter suggestion. See how you feel about it. The one very unusual thing about this plenum was that it was aimed to discuss economic issues. But for the first time, they also threw in national security and defense issues. And as you know, I have been watching a lonely vigil in India at any rate,
yes,
on the frictions between the PLA and its commander-in-chief. If you're okay with that,
let's begin with national security. Sure.
I would like to begin with that.
Yes.
And there's a huge long history and significance to what we are going through in the People's Republic right now. Okay. So if you're okay with that.
Absolutely, Ambassador. Let's begin with Chinese national security and what the third plenum told us about that, and we'll subsequently move to economics. Let's begin with one of your favorite topics, the PLA and Xi Jinping.
Yes, great. Now, I have mentioned to you several times that the real source of the friction is the ground force, what we call the ground force, and what in China, in their own literature, they call the PLA army, which involves using the word army twice because PLA itself stands for People's Liberation Army. It's more like the People's Laceration Army, but leave that for now. Because of the frictions that Xi Jinping has been having with the ground forces, he has made a huge lot of changes from almost the get-go. I think that the real trigger was his visit to India in September 2014 and the incursion into Chumar by the PLA, of which he was not informed. And I think it came as a major unpleasant surprise to him that such things could be done. He had, of course, seen a similar thing done in Depsang the previous year when Premier Li Keqiang was supposed to visit India. And again, the PLA did the same thing, which, by the way, has been almost their standard operating procedure since 1992, when for the first time, an Indian president visited the People's Republic, President Venkataraman, and they greeted him with a major nuclear test. So this kind of pinpricking has been going on non-stop whenever there is a high-level visit. Now, President Xi Jinping decided that he was going to have to do something about it. And so he launched that major restructuring. I'm not saying it was caused by this, but it was certainly triggered by it and expedited by it. And so he launched that major restructuring, the main upshot of which was to put the ground forces on par with the other forces. And of course, he created two new forces. He removed the Second Artillery Corps, which was the nuclear arm, out of the ground force and created a standalone arm of the armed forces. He also gave the ground force their own headquarters. Previously, the CMC, the Central Military Commission, was the headquarters of the ground force. Now he gave them, like all other arms, their own separate headquarters. And the CMC was then restructured into departments responsible for different aspects. Now, in addition, he has been consistently promoting non-ground forces officers wherever possible. I should begin with probably what is the most significant right now, which is Admiral Dong Jun. Admiral Dong Jun is now the Minister of Defense, the first officer not from the ground force to be the defense minister. And how has the system reacted? It's very interesting. You know, since let's say the post-cultural revolution stabilization of Chinese systems, every defense minister has had a seat in the Central Military Commission. Now, there are on paper two different Central Military Commissions. One is the Party Central Military Commission, and the other is the State Central Military Commission. But their membership is identical and their functions are the same, except that one is headed notionally by the president of the country. The second is headed by the party leader, which is why it is very important for the two to remain combined, because otherwise you will have an awkward situation where a president is not in charge of the state commission, or else the party leader is not in charge of the state commission. Now, he brought in this admiral, and every defense minister since 1982 has had a seat ex officio, if you like, in the Central Military Commission, frequently enough even as the deputy chief or the vice chief of the Central Military Commission. Admiral Dong Jun has not been given a seat on the Central Military Commission. I thought, you know, the first occasion came when he was confirmed as defense minister after the National People's Congress, and the defense minister is also the #1 state councillor, which comes under the premier. And I was expecting that Dong Jun would become a state councillor and he would get a seat on the State Central Military Commission, but neither happened. In fact, curiously enough, there was an empty chair when the State Council met, and the expectation was that that was for Dong Jun, but he did not get to sit at that meeting. I then thought maybe it's because they want to put him in the party commission first. And therefore, I was looking to this plenum to see whether he would make it or not. And he has not made it. And by tradition, the defense minister, as I said, either was the vice chief or the senior most ordinary member of the Central Military Commission. Admiral Dong Jun has not made it to either. And of course, you know, as I said, Xi Jinping has been promoting other services over the claims of the ground force. For instance, when the rocket force, when the top two leaders were sacked recently, they were replaced by one man from the Navy, one man from the Air Force. Traditionally, again, it had been, as I said earlier, it was even a part of the ground force and had been headed by the ground force people since the restructuring, and this time not so. So I would count this as a serious setback for Xi Jinping, because now the Central Military Commission, which normally has 7 members, now has 6 members. And my assessment is that the vote right now, if it were taken, it would be 4-2 against Xi Jinping. So that is where I would make my beginning of assessing what has been done in terms of national security and the military. Now, one other curious fact, the previous 2 defense ministers, who were also non-ground force officers, were both charged with discipline violations, in a short way of saying corruption, a long way of saying corruption. And this time, the immediate predecessor, Li Shangfu, has been expelled from the party, but the previous one, they have passed over in silence. So we don't know what has happened to him. And of course, I think this might be the right place also to flag the point that the former foreign minister, Chen Gang, was allowed a graceful exit in the sense that he resigned from the Central Committee, but by implication, he retains his party membership. Now, this can be significant because the current foreign minister, Wang Yi, is holding it on a temporary basis. That's not what they say, but the point is that he is too senior to be a minister because he's a Politburo member now. So, and he's the head of the party Foreign Affairs Commission. So I am guessing that this is a temporary arrangement, admitting at the same time that temporary arrangements can last pretty long. And yet Qin Gang has not been expelled from the party like some of the others who were caught and exposed in the 12 months previous to the sitting of the Central Committee plenum.
Ambassador, that was a fascinating and very detailed, insightful comments on, how the machinations really within the CCP are being conducted vis-a-vis the PLA. Now, let's zoom out a little bit, if I may. In your opinion, Ambassador, all of this, what does it amount to, if I may ask you? For people who don't understand all the nuances in as much depth as you do, if you zoom out, what does this mean? Does that mean Xi Jinping is today, with all this, Machiavellian moves, stronger vis-a-vis the PLA, or has the PLA in fact managed to outsmart him and outgun him in many ways on his own turf?
My answer is quite categoric. Outsmart is possible, outgun is definite. And not surprising. You see, what happened was that very early in his tenure as the General Secretary, Xi Jinping made a speech where he asked himself, if you remember, around that time, 2010 to 2012, 13, there were major upheavals within China, the Bo Xilai case and so on. And there was a great deal of concern, public concern, about the collapse of the People's Republic, for which they were seeking lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, they even made a documentary for Central Committee members to examine how and why the Soviet Union collapsed. After that, I think this was in January 2013, Xi Jinping made a speech where he pointed out two reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said that the first reason was what he called historical nihilism, meaning every
famously,
new leader would
yes,
come and denounce his predecessor. It was always a his. So, and this is what he called historical nihilism. The implication being that, if you say your predecessor was incompetent and corrupt and whatever else, then how do we know you are not? And therefore you are undermining the legitimacy of the party. So this was point number one. And point number two was that the Soviet Union had developed what he called a national army. When I first read it, I was myself a little puzzled. I mean, what is an army if it's not a national army? But what he meant was that the army is the sword arm of the party. And in the Soviet Union, that link had been broken. And he said, so when Yeltsin climbed atop a tank, there was no one to challenge him. In short, what he was saying was that, shorn of all the niceties and the rotundities, the Communist Party of China depended on the army to stay in power. Now, I think with this, he gave hostage to the PLA. And they have, or I guess they were aware of it, after Tiananmen in 1989. There shouldn't have been any doubt about it. But certainly the fact that Xi Jinping himself was willing to admit it put the PLA in a position of relative strength. After that, as I just described in the earlier segment, because of the kind of challenges that they gave to first Li Keqiang and then to himself, he did try very hard to restructure and weaken the ground force. But as of today, to answer your question, there's no doubt about it. The PLA is in the driving seat. And I believe that Xi Jinping is aware of it. At the last Congress, they played a video of the Galwan fighting. Now, the Galwan fighting actually, apart from everything else it may have done or not done, it put paid to the very promising relationship which he had developed with Prime Minister Modi. And when they finished their Mamalipuram summit, in 2019, they parted with assurances of goodwill and a desire to meet again in 2020. And that is what the PLA undid, very thoroughly undid it in June 2020. So I think the fact that despite all this, they played the video clip of the Galwan fighting at the Congress, to me was an indication that the PLA was getting its way. And after all, Xi Jinping was doing something unprecedented. Oh, well, not unprecedented, but certainly something that had not happened since Deng Xiaoping regularized the succession of the leadership, and he went in for a third term as party leader and as president. So I think he needed all the help he could get. And if this was a compromise, well, he was willing to make it. That's how I read events.
I said two or three things cannot but spring to mind at this juncture. Number one, for anybody who's watched it with watched the scenarios with any care, what you paint or what you chart out goes against the grain of popular belief. Popular belief suggests that Xi Jinping is in fact getting Xi Jinping, I'm sorry, is in fact getting stronger and stronger, and with each term as he holds on to power, he's consolidating power upon himself, certainly upon his office, but really upon his very self as a person. And he's in a sense becoming a true dictator. Perhaps all party chiefs have been dictators in China, but in a sense after Mao he holds a bit of an unprecedented accumulation or aggregation of power. That's number one. Number two, one cannot help, Ambassador, but draw parallels to something we have seen in Pakistan. What you just described of the PLA, in a sense, forcing Xi Jinping's hand that, you cannot march down a different path than the one that we choose. And even though you may want to build a better relationship and negotiate better, what will happen finally on the ground is what we want. And if you don't do this, we will create problems on the border that will take the relationship south. This is the story of India and Pakistan in the last many decades. You are saying this story is being repeated in the territory of its all-weather friend, so to speak, China now. What are we to make of these two things, Ambassador?
Yeah. Okay. I think maybe now is the time to establish my credentials as someone who sees things a little differently, but not wrongly. I'll take you back to the year 1982. I was all of 31 that time, and I put forward the hypothesis that German unification was going to happen soon. And you can imagine, I mean, this hypothesis of mine about PLA versus XJP still has some adherents around the world. But this one about German unification, I was in Brussels that time. And I mean, I was laughed out of court. And the loudest laughter would come from the West Germans. I would say, no, my grandfather might feel this way. I certainly don't. We will never be united and so on. And yet when the moment arrived, without a backward glance, without caring for the sentiments of the French or the British, they marched into unity. A few friends were polite enough to congratulate me on having seen something nobody else did. A rarer few even asked me, what was it that led me to this conclusion? But point is that I had seen something which perhaps most others had missed. The second was a little later, I was then in Moscow, and I foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's why I call myself a collapsologist on the side. And again, there was skepticism and even outrage at the very idea that such a thing could happen. And yet, that one came true within a very short period of time. And now, here, I'll tell you something about this particular thing. Firstly, it was around 2014 that I put forward the hypothesis that the Chinese economy was in trouble. And at that time, everyone thought, no, China is heading non-stop to become the largest economy in the world. And again, nobody believed it. But I think now it is pretty much widely accepted that their economy is in very bad trouble. We'll have more time to discuss this. And so, for my good fortune, the fact that I was talking about frictions between the PLA and Xi Jinping, now, the Communist Party of China also has one other regular practice, which happens once in about 40 years or so, on average so far, of a historical resolution. So they did the first one, I think, in 1945, the second in 1981, and the third one they did in 2018 or 19. I think 2018, I'm not sure, but around that time. And in that resolution, see, the trouble is that their documents are very long. This third resolution is, I think, 25,000 words plus. So most people don't read it and simply go by whatever Xinhua or the People's Daily, or if they are interested in deeper insights, they go to Tushi or something like that to try and understand what they have said. I always read original documents and I always process raw data. Now, when I read the full document, the document itself admits that the armed forces were out of control. So I'm fine with being alone, although at the moment I'm not alone. I think there are a few stray voices also. But when the Central Committee itself says that the armed forces have been out of control, that's good enough for me. I don't need for the Western media or any so-called China experts to say that this is the reality. I am pretty sure that this is the reality. As far as the parallel with Pakistan is concerned, I think that is true in the sense in which you describe it, which is to say they seem to have a veto on the progress of India-China ties. But in the case of China, there are other complexities. And if you like, when we discuss the other aspects of the third plenum, we'll come to those, which is that Xi Jinping is not entirely sovereign, not as sovereign as the Western media and even our media make him out to be. I think he is the chairman of everything, as they say about him. But in terms of policy, he does not quite get his way, not just as far as military and national security matters are concerned, but even other issues. To give you an example, if you remember, he had an advisor named Liu He, who was his economic point man, and he negotiated a trade deal with the Americans. And it was a 150-page document, which really met Donald Trump's, who was then the president, met his charges about China having closed its markets to American exports. When this agreement was finally put to the Politburo, they threw it out. He could not implement it. So that tells you the nature of the relationship. They are happy for him to acquire title after title, but as far as policy matters are concerned, he's not quite getting his way. to come back to the third historical resolution, again, he did something which he has done with the third plenum also, which is after the document is released, he puts out his own explanation. Now, in the case of the third historical document, that document was very harsh on Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution. And this is something which Xi Jinping does not agree with. But he could not carry the Central Committee, so he put out his own explanation, as it's called, and it was much milder on Mao Zedong and practically did not mention the Cultural Revolution. He has done the same with this third plenum, which has just ended. So, if you examine the situation carefully in detail with the raw information, you get, I believe, a more accurate picture and a more realistic understanding of the dynamics in play.
Let me ask you then, Ambassador, there is constant conversation about what Xi Jinping wants and how he's refashioning China into this hugely abrasive, competitive country, which is destined to rise, destined to take on the US, destined to take over Taiwan by force if necessary, put all these curbs in a thriving Hong Kong, which, many people now believe is suffering. That's a very different picture. Talk to us a little bit about, this version of Xi Jinping where he is chairman of everything, but perhaps not quite in control of many things, should I say. And please correct me if I'm wrong. How does that, or how should it change our view of two things: US-China competition, what India should expect out of China?
So, as far as India's case is concerned, we have discussed it at some length, perhaps not exhaustive, but good enough, I suppose, for now. You can also take another example, and I didn't quite see it that way then, but I'm, on maturer reflection, I'm wondering if that is also tied in with the same hypothesis, which is that when he went to America, I think Obama was then still the president, in 2015, I think, and he made a formal statement saying that we will not militarize the South China Sea. And then, of course, they went ahead and militarized it. So it is possible that, again, the PLA was acting on its own. But I will say this, on Taiwan, they are all of one mind. And I think that is really the cementing force between Xi Jinping and the PLA. So whatever the differences, he can live without an India rapprochement, but on Taiwan, they are all united, and there is no difference or friction between the various sides. So, it's a bit like our position on the McMahon line. No matter who is the government, no matter what party, this is our standing position. It's the same with them as far as Taiwan is concerned. And of course, if you scratch the surface, the same applies to Tibet and Xinjiang.
Come to Tibet in just a moment, sir, but please continue. You're about to say something. Go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that really the relationship is an evolving one at the same time. And, I don't want to go into all these personnel matters, but the struggle is on. It's not as if Xi Jinping has given up. And I think one of his targets right now is the man who is heading the political work department in the Central Military Commission, a chap who glories in the title of Admiral Mianhua. He's not really a Navy man. He's a ground force man all his life. He was shunted out from the military region dealing with India after 2014 as part of the cleanup that Xi Jinping launched in the Western Theater District, Western Theater Command. So it's a tussle that is not yet finally over. That's the short point.
Let's come back to the third plenum now and to the point that we
Yes.
wanted to talk about, which is economics.
Yes.
What does the plenum tell us about how Xi Jinping and indeed the Chinese Communist Party tackle some of the biggest challenges it faces? Challenges of productivity, challenges of finding export markets, challenges of demography, which is perhaps their biggest challenge and which
Yeah.
will completely transform their economy. Already there's news that China is beginning to dump because it doesn't have places to sort of, accommodate and absorb its capacity. It's begun to dump goods, around the world, but the world may not have the capacity in the same way to absorb these Chinese goods. What does the third plenum tell us about, how Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party look at the very critical issues of economics that it faces or they face?
Right. Right. Okay. First thing I'd say is that the third plenum, which is usually the economic plenum, uh, was last held only in November 2013, which is the 18th Congress Central Committee. The 19th Congress Central Committee did not meet for a purely economic plenum. There was a third plenum, but it discussed many, many things and economic issues only in passing, maybe 5% of the items put out. So really the point of comparison for us is the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, which is November 2013. First thing is that this one was delayed and people were making comments about it, but I think Xi Jinping has explained why there was a delay in his explanation, where he said that we actually decided to hold countrywide consultations. And so he set up a drafting committee with himself as chairman and Wang Huning, who is his ideologue, and two other Politburo Standing Committee members as the drafting committee. But curiously enough, not Li Qiang. Li Qiang is the premier who is in charge of the economy, but he was not a member of the drafting committee. As a Politburo Standing Committee member, of course, he discussed the final documents as they kept coming out. But you'd think he should have been there, but he wasn't. Now, there is a curious sidelight to this, which is worth flagging, which is that after the National People's Congress in March, the tradition has been for the premier to address a press conference. Wen Jiabao used to do very lively ones. Li Keqiang was very professional. But this year, Li Qiang did not do the conference. And he made a speech at the what's called the summer Davos, where his speech was censored because he made a statement. Now, this is where we are really cutting close to the bone. He said that talking about the Chinese economy, the patient is so sick that we cannot administer strong medicine. Now, this line was excised from the text that was circulated, but of course there were people present there who heard it. So one more point about the thing that I have mentioned before, that he has all the titles, but he doesn't have the influence. The 2013 plenum said that the plenum was organized by the Politburo and Xi Jinping made a keynote speech. This time they have said the Politburo presided over the plenum and General Secretary blah, blah, blah. So you can see the nuances that keep coming out. And, in a totalitarian state, this is about all you will get. You won't get the kind of vitriol that you see between our political leaders, for example. So these are very significant signs of the interplay between the different individuals. Now then, on the economic side, frankly, they have given very little in terms of specifics. They have covered some of the points that you have mentioned. If you like, I can read out some of them. I printed them to you. Okay, now let me see first. As I told you earlier, they had 3 documents coming out of this plenum this time, which is 1 more than normal or 2 more than normal. There was a communique, then there was a full resolution, and then there was an explanation by Xi Jinping. Now, I examined the differences. It seems to me that there are 2 trends of 2 policy trends which seem to trouble Xi Jinping. The first is, in 2013, there was a upfront statement saying that the markets will play a decisive role in the allocation of resources. Decisive role. Now, that has been repeated in the text of the resolution, but it has not been touched upon at all in Xi Jinping's explanation, which, as I said, harks back to the 3rd historical resolution, where he tamped down the criticisms of the Cultural Revolution and of Mao Zedong. So it's exactly the same thing that's happened here. He does not even mention the decisive role of the market. He does say that we have to use the market productively, but that's about it. Now, the other issue is opening up. Li Qiang and company are very open about saying reform and opening up. Xi Jinping does not see it quite the same way. He talks about reform, high quality development, deepening reform, but when he talks about opening up, it's like the past tense, something that did happen once and worked well, but without saying so, it doesn't seem to be quite so important to him now. These are the critical things that we saw as far as the 3 separate documents are concerned. No, the other thing is that, you mentioned all those challenges that they are facing. Demographics first and foremost, and I agree with that. Real estate sector is bad shape. Banks are affected by it. The real estate sector is about 25% of their GDP, and the financial systems are under strain. Their stock markets are doing very badly, particularly at a time when the rest of the world is booming. Their stock markets are falling. So all of this adds up to not a very encouraging picture. But if you were to look to the plenum resolution, it's also called decisions in some presentations, but there are very few decisions. There are mainly platitudes that we will work hard to increase the level of employment. We must focus on a better system of education. We must make housing more affordable for the people. How they will do it, where is the money to come from, that kind of thing, you don't get any answers. So look at this, for example, which is in the plenum resolution. They are, as I said, in favor of the markets by refining the mechanisms whereby production factors are priced primarily based on market supply and demand. We will prevent improper government interference in pricing. Now, here's a pretty sharp warning to the government not to get involved where market forces are in play. But these are words. I don't the last time they talked about decisive role was over 10 years ago, and that has not changed. And through the documents, you see that these, if you like, these contradictory ideas are both mentioned. So they do talk about the decisive role of the market, and they do talk about opening up. They also say that we have to safeguard our security, and Xi Jinping is very clear that the state sector is to be the dominant force in the economy. And the terms they use are encourage the public sector and guide, support, and encourage the non-public sector. So, you can, again, as I said, the use of words in these kind of societies is never very harsh, never very open, but the thought behind it is very clear. So this is where I am seeing the plenum having brought the discussion in on the Chinese economy.
As we come towards the end of this conversation, then let me ask you one or two final questions, Ambassador. Correct me if I'm wrong again. The picture that you've painted that emerges from your reading of the documents that emerged after the end of this plenum seems to put China in a far more unstable or shaky ground than is perhaps usually believed. And this belief has also emerged most strongly as the US has seemed to be in doldrums. The US politics is really, I mean, what can one say about US politics today? Europe again in crisis, the UK in crisis, and therefore, relatively from the outside, China looks most solid. But the picture you have painted, derived from the information contained in the plenum documents, is third plenum documents, seem to tell us that China is far more fragile, should I say, than is widely expected. Would that be a correct reading, Ambassador?
Yes, it would be a correct reading. You're right. There seems to be a race to the bottom almost in all the major economies. And I'm very happy that India is an exception to that. But we must try and keep it that way. But definitely, the kind of wild enthusiasm that we used to see about China, and that it's going to be $100 trillion economy and so on. To a student of economics, it was never feasible, and it's certainly not now feasible. And no, for instance, this time, even at Davos, when the Chinese claimed that they had grown at 5.3%, China is a kind of patron saint of Davos, and even there it was greeted with hoots of laughter. No one believes all these figures that they keep putting out. And the word you have used is unstable. What was it? In 2007, I think, Wen Jiabao, who was probably the most plain-speaking politician that we've seen in the People's Republic for quite some time, he pronounced what are called the four uns: unbalanced, uncoordinated, unstable, and unsustainable. And the remedy that he put forward, and this is very important, the remedy that he put forward was to lift domestic consumption. You see, what you said earlier is 100% right. There is a case of overproduction in China because they were producing for an export market. Now, with America and Europe clamping down, they have to find alternative markets. They have to an extent. ASEAN has become their major market now, but it's not enough. It's no substitute for these two big consumer markets.
It's also no substitute in terms of value terms, because volume terms are not the only thing. There's also a value terms part of it.
Absolutely right. And a little digression, if you will allow.
Please.
This concerns us. The second largest single country surplus that China has in its balance of trade is with India, getting close to $100 billion. So we are giving them $100 billion every year while they remain inimical to all our interests. I mean, I find that very hard to understand. And now I believe there was some proposal to invite Chinese investment into India so that they can produce and export to America and other parts of the world. I don't understand all this. I don't see why we must do this. I hope it doesn't happen. But back to the main point, the solution that has been put forward for the last almost 2 decades is domestic consumption. Now, domestic consumption does get not a very honorable mention, but it gets a mention in the Third Plenum document. But when you read it, it's all about government purchases. So, and it's very curious. If you listen to Xi Jinping's speeches, he is still focusing on supply side reform. That's the last thing China needs. China needs demand side reforms. And I mean, we can go back to 1936 to Keynes to understand the importance of domestic demand. And yet, even when they talk domestic demand, they talk about government purchases. So I think they have some understanding problems which they need to overcome, and then perhaps they can get back onto the high growth path. But of course, it's never going to be double digits. And if they carry on like this, it will only keep going downhill. So yes, the picture I have painted is one that I have done after carefully examining the evidence, and I stand by it.
One last question then, Ambassador. If all of this is true, as you say, and all of this is well documented, in your opinion, Ambassador, what explains the continuing belligerence that China is showing, for instance, in the South China Sea? It would seem odd to us that on one hand, they need ASEAN, right? I mean, these are the people who are buying the exports that you desperately need to export, so to speak. And yet, many of them are the targets of your most active belligerence. Your other most active target of belligerence is a country almost the same as your size as far as population is concerned, which gives you 100 billion a year. This makes no sense, Ambassador.
Look, it makes no sense from our point of view. As far as China is concerned, they're happy. They have the best of both worlds. They can bully you when they need you, and they can sell to you when they want to. You are the suckers who are falling for it. So I believe that the remedy is in our hands, not in China's hands. Why would they change this? It's perfect for them. So the PLA is running wild in the South China Sea and in the Himalayan heights, and their businesses are flooding our markets with their goods. Happy all around.
On that extremely astute and perceptive note, and really a note for us to look into the mirror really deeply, and of course our ASEAN cousins to look into the mirror deeply. We'll have to leave it at that. Ambassador, thanks very much, Ambassador Prabhat Shukla. As always, a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your very astute and incisive comments on the third plenum that we just saw concluded in China. Thanks, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure talking to you and facing your penetrating questions. So great to be with you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.